All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Dan's Astrology. Today I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm going to be looking at charts, and particularly what I have in mind is the upcoming Canadian election. And of course, the election, the main candidates are Mark Carney, Pierre Poilievre, and Jagmeet Singh. However, Jagmeet Singh and the NDP are not looking very strong this election, unfortunately. So I'm not going to be looking at Jagmeet's chart. And obviously, Justin Trudeau is no longer the prime minister, and he won't be running in this election. He's been replaced by Mark Carney. But I thought if you're going to understand the dynamic of this election, it helps, I think, to start with Justin Trudeau's chart, even though he's not running, and to look at the day that he announced his resignation, which interestingly enough is January 6th, 2025, and is almost, I think, a certain symbolic resonance. I mean, I don't think he, because if you know how January 6th is a day that has become synonymous with a certain thing that happened around the reaction to Trump losing the election to Biden. So there's something about the friction that was going on between Trump and Trudeau leading up to Trudeau announcing his resignation, namely the threats of making Canada the 51st state, as well as calling Trudeau the governor of Canada and all this kind of stuff. And so if you look at the the resignation of Trudeau setting up this election, because first of all, prior to the resignation of Trudeau, the conservative opposition was fairly popular, but then it was in the aftermath of this moment that the conservatives kind of lost their edge, because basically there was this kind of triggered an influx of support for the Liberal Party, for Canadian liberalism, and standing up for Canadian liberal values in the face of an increasingly scary-looking, autocratic, authoritarian, fascist state, which was making all kinds of like imperialistic threats to take away Canada's sovereignty. Right. So there's something about it where, like, after this moment, the Conservatives built a lot of their campaign around a kind of character assassination of Trudeau. And then with Trudeau not there anymore, there's not really, it kind of took away their edge in a lot of way, right? But aside from that, there are certain things worth noting about this whole dynamic. If you look at Trudeau's chart, and the most interesting one of the most interesting ones anyways, is the fact that he has natally Mars in Pisces at 29 degrees, and Neptune has recently ingressed into Aries, but in doing so, Neptune had to transit Trudeau's Mars in at the very end of Pisces. And so there's something about the idea of, if you look at Canada's national chart, Canada was founded with a Neptune in Aries. And so the transit of Neptune into Aries goes both with Canada's Neptune return, as well as transiting Trudeau's natal Mars placement, which is at the very. So it's this kind of like, this is in astrology, this is where the spring equinox is, and it's known as if you use Aries as the first sign, the beginning of the zodiac versus the end of the zodiac, the beginning and that kind of like the alpha and the omega, if you will, or this kind of like there's a lot of stuff around Christianity is very associated with this, which I talked about in another video, right? But there's something about all this where I also relate to this as a Mars and Pisces native, although my Mars and Pisces is more towards the beginning end of the sign. That when I experienced this same transit of Neptune and Pisces transiting my Mars, I went through a major mental health crisis, had to quit my job, had to take some time off, that kind of stuff. So I think there's something about Neptune in Pisces and and Trudeau's a Mars in Pisces, signaling like at the very end the time to call it quits, right? A time to throw in the towel. And I think there's something about that. Now that Neptune's out of it, it seems astrologically timed that having Neptune out of Pisces and into Aries kind of marks the beginning of the post Trudeau era. And if you look at, there's other things going on with this as well, where if you also notice how you have Pluto in Aquarius and how America just went through its Pluto return when Pluto was transiting the late stage of Capricorn here. So now, if you look at the Pluto dynamic, Pluto, Trudeau has Venus in Aquarius and North Node in Aquarius, as well as Saturn at the 0 degree of Gemini, right? Now, as we're looking at the larger transits that are going on this year, there's been a lot of talk about the Saturn-Neptune conjunction and Neptune and Saturn both going into Aries. At the time of recording this, Saturn is still in Pisces. But eventually what we're going to have happen is we're going to have Uranus and Taurus make this ingress into Gemini, which will then transit Trudeau's natal Saturn placement. And of course, Saturn standing for the Senex, the old man, and all. There's something about, again, maybe a marker of this, something about the beginning of Aquarius and the beginning of Gemini, and having Pluto and Uranus trining this point, which is a very obviously a sensitive position in Trudeau's chart, which is also maybe, you know, exact like a good it's in the stars, a transition point away from Justin Trudeau, basically, right? And I just thought I'd share this anyways for what it's worth, because there's some sort of there's some obvious thing going on here with it, I would say, right? I don't know if there's anything else I really want that's not really necessary to show about Trudeau's chart, so I will switch here, and you have to bear with me here because I'm still figuring out this program. But if let's so Trudeau announced his resignation on the January 6th, the anniversary of the day that the crazy Trump supporters all tried to throw some kind of insurrection in the White House or whatever it was. And the day that he actually switched over with Mark Carney, for those who are not aware about how this works, that we're calling an election, but he needed to pick somebody to fill in his shoes as the leader of the Liberal Party to run for the Liberals in the next election. So Mark Carney was put in as the Prime Minister unelected, and now we're having an election to see if the public accepts him as the leader or whether they'd rather have Pierre Poilievre. And I would just like to, to kind of just double up what I was saying earlier about this transition moment. If you notice, at this point in time, when they actually made the transition between Trudeau and Carney, Neptune was perfectly conjunct Mars at the 29th degree of Pisces here. Venus was perfectly conjunct Pluto at the third degree, and Jupiter in Gemini was also opposite Trudeau's natal Mercury by 1 degree. You had a bunch of these kinds of dynamics going off where just the transits that were already kind of like getting activated when he made his announcement were becoming even more intense at the time when they made the transition. So, um, to keep it simple, rather than I guess we can just look at the charts on their own here. This is Mark Carney, and there's another thing worth pointing out is that we're going through an eclipse season where we just had the last lunar eclipse in Aries and the last solar eclipse in Aries for a while, and then the first lunar eclipse of Virgo, and then later on in Virgo season we're going to have a lunar eclipse in Pisces. So we're having eclipses for the next 18 months on the Virgo Pisces axis. And with that in mind, it's striking to look at Mark Carney's chart and to notice that he has a Pisces stellium, as well as a Virgo stellium, including a full moon in Virgo. And this is the whole... I'm approaching my attitude in recording this astrological analysis of the Canadian election. I'm doing this from a point of view of trying to be politically neutral, because I have to admit, from a political point of view, I am more sympathetic to Mark Carney, but there is something about, there's certain pressures to do with war and the fact that if we can't rely on America as a ally in the same way that we used to, or that the whole backdrop of all this is that Canada and our sovereignty, that we have to stand up against the Americans, or that they're putting pressure on us for military spending and all this kind of stuff. There's something about this where I just like to say, as a young Canadian growing up, I remember being educated as a young man about the Canadian military and the Canadian military industrial complex. And there's actually, something to remind you all about is the Avro Arrow, which was before they had the age of modern fighter jets. When the Canadians had a research and development team for military industrial technology, where we were making these pioneering advancements in these at the time very, very sophisticated new forms of jet engine, and this was embodied in the Canadian Avro Arrow. And I think it was it Eisenhower or Diefenbaker at the time, was like very put off by the fact that we had a strong industry for like developing military technology and engineering, and basically they shut down the whole project, right? And ever since then, Canadians have been these kind of like, I think the Americans kind of take comfort in the fact that they have this neighbor that is relatively non-threatening, because we don't have much of a military, we don't have much of a big industry for designing weapons and fighter jets and all this kind of stuff, and that basically the Americans have a monopoly on all this, and they try to sell us really expensive fighter jets rather than us having an engine, a whole industry where we do this ourselves, right? So there's this kind of shift in focus now about with whatever kind of plan Mark Carney has, in that, I'm not really sure. Are we going to go back to the days of the Avro Arrow, where we're going to be designing our own fighter jets, or having our own? There's something though about, if you consider why I'm bringing this up, because Uranus is all about technology, all about technological development. And when you put Uranus and Pluto and Mars in a triple conjunction with the moon, there's something about this where I have to just, looking at Mark Carney's astrology, I'm a little bit concerned that like we're going like there might be it might be too aggressive almost, right? This is like, but this is the whole thing, is that coming into this, Mark Carney has been, there's been a campaign that he's done where he got help from Mike Meyers, who's popularizing this whole elbows up thing. But there's something about Mark Carney's chart where if it's all about defending Canadian sovereignty and all, like there's something about it where I'm almost a little bit concerned at the amount of force that is indicated in basically having a Virgo Pisces eclipse season and having like the bases fully loaded to just like, we're just going to unleash the might of Canadian military power and be a force to be reckoned with if we vote Mark Carney, right? That's kind of like how it comes off with having Uranus, Pluto, Mars, and all conjunct within 1 degree here. It's pretty, this is quite, I haven't seen any other astrologers talk about this, and quite frankly, I'm just saying, as from the point of view as a person who's naturally inclined to be more of pacifistic, or I'm not into being like a military hawk kind of guy. There's something about, like, if I vote for Carney, this is basically my kind of concern right now, is that maybe he would almost be too much like that, right? But if this is what we have to do, like, is it better to be like that than to ensure Canadian sovereignty and to not, to ensure we have our own government intact, our own political agency intact, and we're not just getting bulldozed over by whatever's happening south of the border? Maybe he's good for that. I don't know, right? The other thing, of course, is if you look at Pierre Poilievre's chart. Now, the other thing too is that Mark Carney's chart, apparently we have a A-rated birth time. So this is like, you can trust this time of 7:56 a.m. as being an accurate birth time for Mark Carney. Apparently we can rely on the fact that he has Taurus rising with Jupiter in Taurus conjunct the ascendant. But we don't know what Pierre Poilievre's birth time is. But if you compare charts anyways, there is something similar in that Pierre Poilievre also has a moon in Virgo. And while the thing is that Mark Carney's, to me, Mark Carney reminds me of the story of the Avro Arrow because of the Uranus, Pluto, Mars, kind of like there's this big shebang of energy going on. And I think if you compare instead Poilievre's moon in Virgo, you have a bit of a different dynamic because you have the North Node in Virgo and you have Saturn in Virgo. And of course, Saturn kind of stands for the Senex or the old man, and there could be something to do with Canadian conservatism, about how there's a certain kind of tension going on in this dynamic because you have the old guard conservatives, Canada, are typically, if you're over the age of 50, if you're a senior citizen, if you've got gray hair, you're kind of likely to vote conservative because they embody these kind of like old-fashioned ideals of, just your like boring white conservatives, right? But the thing is, this kind of voting base tends to, it's like, stand up for the principles of our country. It's maybe not the people that feel very comfortable about being annexed by Canada, unless they're the kind of old people that are like so obsessed with crossing the border to buy cheap stuff from, the duty-free shops, and they really just want to have cheap stuff from America more than they care about national sovereignty or something like that. Then maybe they just want to capitulate and give into the United States or something. But there's something about they don't really. There might be a lot of old conservatives who don't feel comfortable with the new generation of the alt-right edgelords, of like kind of angsty kids who play too many video games, who are frustrated because they can't get laid, and so that they listen too much Joe Rogan or something like that, and they're like the red-pilled. There's something about that dynamic where I feel like these are two demographics that actually are fairly at odds with each other, but nonetheless unite under a similar distaste for what stands for liberalism, right? And there's something about Pierre Poilievre is kind of like playing this game where it's like trying to stretch the umbrella of what Canadian conservatism means enough so that you can not alienate your old base of old people, but and then like make yourself appealing enough to a generation of sort of angsty, red-pilled, young testosteronal young males who scoff at the principles of liberalism, and he's kind of got this challenge of trying to straddle those two things. And I think that maybe there's something about all this where if you consider a lot of the times people are comparing Pierre Poilievre to Donald Trump, and one of the things that Pierre Poilievre has in common with Donald Trump from the position of astrology is that they're both Gemini Suns, right? And I think there's something about this where I personally feel like Poilievre is a guy who's been a career politician ever since he's been a young man, and he's just been raised in this structure or this atmosphere of Canadian conservatism, and I feel like he more represents that kind of like, like that kind of stuff rather than the populist rebelliousness. But there's something about the sign of the Gemini, which you often say of being two-faced or having different masks or different things you can put on, right? And there's something, what I found really interesting was that when the whole Trump populism was mirrored in the UK with characters such as Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage and stuff like that. And if you look at Boris Johnson's natal chart, Boris Johnson is also a Gemini, but there's something about it works in my mind, it works for Trump and Johnson because they're both these guys who kind of like, they're like Muppet politicians where they look like they're some kind of cartoon character and they have this crazy blonde hair and like nobody takes it. And I feel like Poilievre is just not like he's a Gemini. Maybe he has ability to put on a mask or try to like play to two different crowds or something, but I think there's something about him where he's just, to me, he doesn't seem like a Boris Johnson or a Donald Trump or anything like that. He's his own guy. But there's something about it where the traditional conservatives are going to vote for him because they're comfortable that he's not too much like that, right? Like that, his power comes more from the fact that he's not like that, and that the old conservative voting base can rely on him not to be a Trump populist, and that gives him some kind of security. But then if he goes too far in that direction, he loses the young generation. But I think there's like, what I'm trying to say is when you've got North Node conjunct Saturn, so compared to Carney, which is like a full moon thing between Virgo and Pisces, you've got only a quarter moon going on, and that quarter moon is conjunct Saturn in the North Node. So there's something about the hungry demon and the old man where it's like you're just kind of like there's this insatiable craving to appeal to the old white-haired, like stodgy conservatives who they don't, the progressivism confuses them, and you got to keep things really simple for them, and they're kind of like they're going to donate money to your party, but they're going senile, and they don't really understand things, and so you got to keep things really simple to them. But then if you do too much of that, you're starting to alienate the young generation or something. Like there's this kind, like that to me is the tension with Pierre Poilievre, right? And I think I kind of feel like also if you let's see if I can get this going. No. There's something about this program that is kind of counterintuitive to me. Here we go. Okay. If we progress, the election itself happens on April the 28th. So if we look at what's going on at the actual day of the election, we can see that it's happening under a new moon in Taurus, right? And the moon, as it starts to separate from the sun, is going to conjunct Uranus, showing that there is a certain kind of rebellious, unpredictable, kind of chaotic upheaval going, and that on Poilievre's side, he does have Venus around here, But then he also has Mars and Chiron being the wounded healer, and the sun is basically conjuncting these kind of things. So it could very well be that he comes close, misses it, and it's kind of traumatic, and now he's kind of just injured, right? He's just like injured and angry, and he feels, and now he's going to be the opposition leader, and he's going to be carrying this sort of wound as like, I could have won and I lost, and I'm angry and I'm upset, and now I have to be the opposition, and I'm just going to have to yell at Mark Carney and say, things like, come up with new slogans like axe the tax or whatever, right? And then, as you can see, Jupiter, although there is Jupiter conjunct his Mercury, and so I don't know, things could go lucky for him because he does have a lot of benefic action happening as transits to his chart. Maybe he will win, I don't know, right? I'm trying to be neutral here. You can also see that there's going to be this Sun Mars Pluto T-square, which is coming into effect, that is basically going to be T-squaring close to his Chiron, his wounded healer. So there could be some kind of, and that of course he also has a Uranus in Scorpio, which is more or less opposite to this new moon. Things like that. I don't know. I'm just doing this kind of quickly. I'm just showing you what I got here. Some of the things I've been looking at. I'm going to also show you if you look at what's going on for Mark Carney, it's interesting because he's having his Mercury return on that day, which is probably a good sign for, the whole thing about coming up with a plan for your platform and making good speeches and all this kind of stuff, right? So having a Mercury turn is probably pretty fair. He also had a Venus return recently. It's also interesting to consider that if you notice that when Trudeau announced his resignation, Venus was in Pisces, and then we had this Venus retrograde, and then this Venus retrograde conjunct Saturn, both matches up with Carney's Venus and Saturn. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the eclipses are also hitting off this loaded stelliums that Carney has. The Mars-Pluto T-square doesn't seem to affect Carney very much, although Carney does have this Jupiter-Neptune opposition in the fixed signs, but it's in the second to third decan, whereas the Mars-Pluto Sun T-square is in the first decan. So Mark Carney does not seem to be as affected by some of these tensions happening right now. And the new moon in Taurus was going to have the moon and Uranus conjunct Carney's Jupiter, which is also a benefic planet and a good sign. So I think it's both of these politicians, Carney and Poilievre, are both having fairly benefic aspects happening from Jupiter and Venus. Or like the new moon. Like if you look at this though, this Taurus placements, because the new moon in Taurus seems to be more conducive to Carney because he just has this Jupiter there, whereas Poilievre has this Mars and Chiron where it seems to me like that kind of goes with him being like the voice of the opposition or the disenfranchised, angsty young generation, or trying to like balance that thing between like being young and being old, or trying to appeal to the older generation. Whereas Carney is he's older than Trudeau by 6 years. So Carney kind of comes in dad mode of kind of representing the kind of a mature liberalism, right? Versus a kind of the young guy playing for the Conservatives who that maybe the older generation of the Conservatives don't trust as much because they're suspicious of this kind of like Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage, or Donald Trump style populism. This is basically my read on the Canadian election. And of course, it is a little bit tense with this Mars Pluto Sun T square. But I don't know. This is what I got. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Stay tuned for more.